In 1988, if you had asked anybody in the software industry to name the 3 companies that mattered most, you would have got the same answer: Microsoft, Lotus, and Ashton Tate. Ashton Tate was the creator of Dbase, which held 63% of the entire personal computing database market, having over 1 million licenses sold and more than $250 million in revenue. 12 months later, from that 1988 peak, that 63% market share went down to 43%, which meant Ashton Tate had in a single year lost 1/3 of its own market share. 3 years after that, it would cease to exist, in one of the fastest collapses in software history. What is strange is how its incredibly fast collapse occurred. For once, it wasn't the crushing hand of Microsoft, nor a predatory acquisition that mismanaged it to irrelevance. Rather, Ashton Tate destroyed itself. It made an enemy out of the very people that were the foundation of its success, suing its own customers to protect its empire while destroying trust. And in one of the most spectacular backfirings in tech history, one of those lawsuits would expose how Ashton Tate's own so-called proprietary technology wasn't even theirs to begin with, opening up the floodgates for a burgeoning clone market to eat Ashton Tate alive. This is the incredible story of the fastest collapse in the history of the software industry, how Ashton Tate so spectacularly destroyed itself. The story of Ashton Tate began about a decade before its founding with an office football pool. In the late 1970s, at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a programmer named Wayne Ratliff wanted to track the results of an office betting pool, so he used a mainframe database system called JPL-DIS to build an initial version of the program. And it occurred to him that something similar to that program would be useful on the microcomputer he had at home, so he wrote a program for that microcomputer. What Ratliff ended up building turned out to be far more than a way to count football results. It was a sophisticated piece of software that could store and retrieve structured information, and it could run small text programs that told it what to do, which made it something closer to a programming language wrapped around a database. Ratliff figured that this software had a far broader application, so he called it Vulkan and started selling it by mail order. A man named George Tate would stumble upon the software. Tate and his partner saw immense potential in the piece of software and understood immediately that this was worth way more than a mail order side business. So they licensed it from Ratliff, and in 1980 they started a company named Ashton Tate, with Vulkan being renamed to Dbase, with its first version being called Dbase 2, because Dbase 1 would give the impression that the software was created by a new upstart instead of an established company, which was the actual truth. Dbase 2 would be launched in 1980, and in 1982 it was ported to the massively popular IBM PC, and that's when everything changed for the young company. The IBM PC was a standard setting computer. From the moment it launched, the entire personal computer industry quietly organized itself around the IBM PC, but what was more important for Dbase was the clientele that the IBM PC attracted. IBM was a giant of mainframe computing, and it built over decades quite an extensive list of deep relationships with corporate America. So when the IBM PC arrived on the market, corporate America and small businesses were more than willing to buy an IBM PC. This was perfect for Dbase because it was the exact market Dbase software was built for. Businesses ran on records like customer names, inventory tracking, order numbers, and payroll management. Before Dbase, putting those records on a personal computer meant buying an expensive specialist system or not doing it at all. Dbase gave the power to the professionals and small businesses to set up rather sophisticated databases right on their own personal computers and keep track of all their important information, making the hard decision of painful paper records or complicated specialist systems no longer necessary. But the magic of Dbase wasn't merely the database itself. It was the language that came alongside the database. Dbase came with a programming language built around commands that read almost like English, approachable in a way mainframe systems were not, which meant people who were not trained computer scientists could build real business software with it with relative ease. An entire industry began to spring up around Dbase, thousands of independent developers making their living writing Dbase applications for local companies, every one of them a staunch advocate of the product. The army of developers built Ashton Tate into a giant. By 1984, 4 years into the life of Dbase, it hit a revenue of $35 million, making it the 6th largest software company in America at the time. By 1987, 3 years later, revenue had grown nearly tenfold to $300 million. By then, it had sold over 1 million licenses and had 63% market share of the personal computing database market, standing alongside Microsoft and Lotus as one of the 3 most important software companies in personal computing. Dbase's massive popularity made its language become an industry standard, and standards attract competitors. If thousands of developers already knew this language and millions of Dbase files already existed, then any product that spoke the same language and read the same files could compete for the entire install base without asking anybody to learn anything new. So the clones came. Fox Software built FoxBASE, which ran Dbase code faster than Dbase did. Nantucket built Clipper, which compiled Dbase code into standalone programs you could sell. These were not shoddy imitations. In several aspects, they were better than the original. Ashton Tate's response was rather interesting. Instead of embracing the growth of its community, it chose to sue it. Ashton Tate had always maintained that everything about Dbase was proprietary, and from its own point of view, the clones were parasites building businesses on a language Ashton Tate had spent years and millions of dollars turning into an industry standard. So it went after the clone vendors in court. But there is a difference between defending a product and declaring war on your own ecosystem, and Ashton Tate could not see where that line was. Every developer who learned the language, whoever they bought their tools from, was another person invested in the standard Ashton Tate had created. Suing the surrounding market told the whole industry what kind of company Ashton Tate was, and the people watching most closely were the independent developers whose livelihoods depended on that language. And in one of the most spectacular backfirings in tech history, one of those lawsuits would expose how Ashton Tate's own so-called proprietary technology wasn't even theirs to begin with. In its case against FoxBASE, evidence surfaced that Dbase's file format and language traced back to JPL-DIS, the mainframe program used at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the one Wayne Ratliff had been using when he built Vulkan, the program that later became Dbase. The judge in charge of the case, having initially ruled in Ashton Tate's favor, reviewed the matter and reversed his ruling and favored FoxBASE. Ashton Tate had gone to court to prove it owned the Dbase language, and in the process of making the argument, it produced evidence that proved that it technically didn't. The clone makers made the most out of the ruling, and the term XBase entered the industry to describe a whole family of Dbase compatible languages. Meanwhile, the company was coming apart internally. Wayne Ratliff, the man who wrote the original program, left and went to work for a competitor. Ashton Tate sued him too, and unfortunately, Judge Tate, the main spearhead of the company in its early years, had died. So by the end of the 1980s, the founder was gone, the original developer was gone, and the company was in litigation with a significant portion of its own industry. Accounts from inside describe a management culture that had turned combative and by some description ruled through intimidation, all of which was happening while the most important product release in the company's history was in development. Dbase 4 had been promised for years. It was supposed to be the answer to everything, the version that would absorb every capability the clones offered and reassert the original's dominance for another decade. The developer community, frustrated with the lawsuits and the leadership, was prepared to forgive a great deal if the product delivered on its high expectations. When it shipped in October of 1988, it was late, it was slow, and it had serious memory management problems. It was riddled riddled with bugs. To understand how much damage that did, think about who was actually using this. Dbase developers were not writing software for fun. They were building the systems that ran their clients' companies, and they had stacked their professional reputations on recommending Dbase. When Dbase 4 arrived, slow and unstable, they were the ones who had to explain to a client why the invoicing system had stopped working properly. Ashton Tate had not merely shipped a poor product, it had embarrassed the thousands of people whose advocacy had built the company, and those people had somewhere else to go. That is the detail that made this collapse so violent. Ashton Tate had spent a decade turning its language into an industry standard, and it had succeeded so completely that when its own product failed, its entire installed base could switch to a competitor without rewriting a single line of code. The developers moved to FoxBASE and Clipper and other competitors, taking their clients with them, and none of them had to start over. The decline in market share was dramatic. 63% of the market in 1988, down to 43% in 1989. In its final year as an independent company, Ashton Tate lost $40 million and laid off 400 of its 1,800 employees, in an incredible fall from grace for a company that was once considered one of the 3 most important software companies of the late 80s. The chief executive, Ad Asper, had been trying to merge the company for years, and the list of companies Ashton Tate held discussions with is genuinely remarkable. Net, Computer Associates, Infomix, Symantec, and the list also included, shockingly, Microsoft. A merger with Lotus in 1985 was briefly considered when both companies were near their peak. It would have created a software powerhouse capable of standing against anybody, and maybe even, if history was willing, had been a formidable competitor to Microsoft, but for some reason it never went through. In February of 1991, the board would end up removing Asper as its chief executive. Then in September of that year, Ashton Tate was acquired by Borland for $439 million. But this is where things got tricky for Dbase, because Borland already had an in-house database. Paradox was Borland's own product, competing directly against Dbase, and Borland had just spent nearly $500 million buying its rival, damaged, declining product line. 6 months later, in March of 1992, Microsoft bought Fox Software for $173 million, acquiring Fox Pro, the clone that had been eating Dbase from below. Microsoft had also been working with Ashton Tate on Dbase technology, and that work eventually fed into a product Microsoft shipped. It was called Microsoft Access. Borland struggled to revive Dbase and eventually sold the rights onto a small company that kept it alive as a niche software. The entire personal computing database market would eventually almost entirely consolidate around one product, Microsoft Access. If you want me to make a video about how Microsoft Access eventually took over the desktop database market, let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.